Gingerbread houses. These days, the gingerbread house has transcended its origins in 19th century German literature to become a familiar part of Christmas celebrations around the world. But as Therese Taylor reminds us, this seasonal sweetmeat has a complicated history that embraces pagan and Christian traditions and the darker side of folklore and fairy tales. The gingerbread house, a miniature cottage with walls of gingerbread and lavish decorations around the door, windows, and roof, has become an increasingly popular component of Christmas celebrations. These beautiful and edible creations show that Christmas continues to be a cultural meeting ground for pagan and Christian legends, as well as literature and folklore. Christmas has previously absorbed themes from the classical world of Saturnalia and the Nordic world of Yuletide, and in the late 20th century the festival took up the gingerbread house, a theme from 19th century popular literature, and repackaged it as a seasonal table decoration. The history of the gingerbread house relates to holy rituals, celebrations, and the fiery, life-giving history of the ginger root, an ancient and significant spice. But, as we shall see, it also draws on darker materials. Into the woods. The story of Hansel and Gretel begins with a family afflicted by famine. They have no food to eat, and the mother tells the father to abandon the children, who they can no longer afford to feed, in the forest. Hansel and Gretel overhear this plan, and Hansel takes white pebbles with him in his pocket. The next day, when his father leads them into the forest, Hansel drops the pebbles along the path, and, later, the children use them to find their way home. The parents welcome the children back, but only for a short time. Soon they are hungry again, and the mother once again tells the father to leave the youngsters in the forest. He is unwilling at first, but is eventually worn down by her insistence. This time, Hansel uses breadcrumbs to mark the way, but these are eaten by birds, and the children have no path to follow. They wander, starving, deep in the woods. Then, they come across a beautiful cottage, all made of bread, cakes, and spun sugar. The children start eating pieces of this magical cottage. It is made of food because it is owned by a witch who wants to lure visitors within. The witch, who lies in wait for her prey, is old and malign. The witch's eyes were red, and she could not see very far, but she had a keen scent, like the beasts, and knew them very well when human creatures were near. When she knew that Hansel and Gretel were coming, she gave a spiteful laugh and said triumphantly, "I have them, and they shall not escape me." After enticing the children with more food and clean beds, the witch takes them prisoner. Hansel is locked up in a stable, where the witch intends to fatten him before slaughter. Every day she grabs his finger from between the bars, in order to test if he is plump enough for eating. But, in another of the story's use of false appearances, Hansel is using a chicken bone instead of his finger to deceive her. Gretel, meanwhile, is forced to work as a maid. One day the witch orders her to fire up the oven, and tells her to sit in it to see if the bread is laid out. Gretel, using a trick often employed in Middle Eastern tales of jinn, asks the witch to go into the oven and show her how it is done. As soon as the witch enters the oven, Gretel slams the doors and bakes her alive. The witch has suffered the traditional penalty. Burnings of women suspected of witchcraft were particularly numerous in German-speaking Europe, where this tale originated. Early versions of the story, from the 17th century, were probably told by people who had witnessed such executions. Oh, how frightfully she howled, but Gretel ran away, and left the wicked witch to burn miserably. Now free, Hansel and Gretel take treasures from the witch's cottage and go home. Their father welcomes them, their mother having died. Origins. The first published version of Hansel and Gretel appeared in 1812 as part of an anthology, Household and Children's Tales, by the Brothers Grimm. It has been suggested that the origins of this story may date back to the medieval era, as every element of the tale is pre-industrial. Some believe that it relates to accounts of the Great Famine of the early 14th century. Between 1315 and 1322, all of northern Europe was hit by successive waves of crop failures, social crises, and the breakdown of markets. This catastrophe was so great that it would have left lasting traces in the culture, but there were many famines between the Dark Ages and the 1800s when the Brothers Grimm were travelling around Germany and collecting stories. Another significant event was still to come, when Europe was hard hit by the crop failures of 1848. Famine was a recurrent nightmare for Europeans. It provides every element of the story of Hansel and Gretel, where food, breadcrumbs, temptations, and a fiery oven engage the reader's attention. Witchcraft is also a key part of the tale, and it is this element which makes the story thrilling rather than sordid and depressing. The witch is hateful, her downfall calls for rejoicing, and she creates magical lures which give the shimmer of unreality to scenes of otherwise gloomy reality. The Brothers Grimm. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were scholarly, middle-class brothers born in the late 18th century in the state of Hesse. There was no unified German nation at the time, and the brothers' lives spanned eras of upheaval. The French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the uprisings of the early 19th century, utopian nationalistic projects, and eras of famine and mass unemployment were all known to them. They shared the hope of many German-speaking people that the nation would be unified, although they did not live to see it. But they may well have contributed to this project through their work, helping to shape a sense of national identity by collecting traditional tales, popularizing an idealized literary image of the peasant life, and spreading the German language through well-written, easy-to-read, and entertaining text. The Brothers Grimm asked many people to share their stories, which they then wrote down and edited for publication. The brothers' work was not that of professional folklorists, and their purpose was not to simply preserve traditional spoken tales, but to represent them in literary form. They re-edited and elaborated the stories they heard, giving suitable moral lessons and emphases. The tale of Hansel and Gretel was changed by the brothers as it went through several editions. In 1812, the story was harsh and simple, as explained in the Oxford Companion to Fairy Tales. They persistently lengthened and altered the tale from the early terse manuscript version from 1810, adding names for the children and Christian motifs in 1812, transforming the mother to a stepmother in 1819, and further rationalizing the abandonment of the children in 1843 and in 1857. Out of the more than 200 tales published in the Grimm's collection, it was Hansel and Gretel which became the most famous. This particular story, of the abandoned children tempted by a magical cottage in the forest, has proved particularly memorable. It has elements which not only work in the context of storytelling, but lend themselves particularly well to illustration and visual effects. Dark themes. The theme of cannibalism in Hansel and Gretel is certainly the most disturbing aspect of the story. The children are threatened first with infanticide, through abandonment by their parents, and then with cannibalism by the witch. The accusation that witches, like Jews and heretics, ate human flesh or blood was a staple of medieval sectarian propaganda. As Norman Cohn explained in his 1975 study, Europe's Inner Demons, infanticide and cannibalism were allegations made against any outgroups of medieval Christendom, and these traditions date back to the 2nd century. For Jewish populations, and for women suspected of witchcraft, the tales about consuming the flesh of children had fatal outcomes. Innumerable people were lynched or burned alive because they were suspected of these imaginary crimes. The story of Hansel and Gretel showed both sides of the traditional tales about dangers to children. It repeats the old curse about witches eating children, but it also makes clear who exactly it is that plans to have the children killed, their own parents. The story, put in written form after the Enlightenment but before the Industrial Revolution, retains magic but begins to shed the light of reason on human relationships. Although known as a German tale, Hansel and Gretel may draw upon Slavic folklore of the Baba Yaga, a witch who roamed the forests, carrying a pestle and mortar and seeking children whom she would eat. The homicidal role of the parents of Hansel and Gretel may have been disagreeable to the story's early audiences. As noted, in later editions of the tale, the mother becomes a stepmother, and thus can be distanced from family bonds and more easily seen as evil. The return of the children and their reconciliation with their father was also extended and given more moral weight. As it is, the story places an emphasis on feminine evil, and it is easy to see that the witch and the stepmother are two versions of the same character. Scholars who have studied the Hansel and Gretel tale have commented on what it teaches children, and also the presence of female archetypes in the story. Bruno Bettelheim suggested that it is a cautionary tale, and that the greed of the children is being rebuked. They are so eager for food that they ignore the obvious dangers of the enchanted cottage made of cake. Feminist scholars such as Maria Tata have pointed out that the story is about women's power used for evil ends. Instead of cooking food and nurturing children, the women of the tale abandon or eat them. In her book on the Grimm's tales, Tata suggests that all the evil women in their stories are versions of the one woman. What is especially remarkable about fairy tales is the extent to which they inflate maternal evil. As a cautionary tale, it would appear that the first lesson children would learn from Hansel and Gretel is not to trust their parents, a lesson only softened by the emphasis put on the figure of the evil stepmother. I also believe that this is a tale which articulates the role of food in sustaining life, as well as hunger and as a primal urge which dissolves our morals and relationships into illusions. Fairy tales, as a genre, are often studied for what they teach children about the world, but their power is more likely to derive from the way that they reflect a child's view of the world, with all its distortions and its exaggerated restatement of cultural patterns. The Gingerbread House. The gingerbread house echoes the theme of food in a reflexive, symbolic way that shows the workings of the unconscious mind. The house seems to be edible and delicious, but it is a prison where children are not fed, but rather turned into food. In the story, the witch's cottage is made of various foodstuffs, and when eating it, the children are prey, like mice before a cat. The house was built of bread and roofed with cakes, and the window was of transparent sugar. "We will have some of this," said Hansel, "and make a fine meal. I will eat a piece of the roof, Gretel, and you can have some of the window. That will taste sweet." So Hansel reached up and broke off a bit of the roof, just to see how it tasted, and Gretel stood by the window and gnawed at it. Then they heard a thin voice call out from inside, "Nibble, nibble, like a mouse. Who is nibbling at my house?" The cottage in the Grimm's tale is not made of gingerbread. This is a later interpretation, added by bakers making cottages with a folkloric look. Gingerbread has the qualities needed, as it is of dense structure, non-perishable, and has a hard surface ideal for decorations. The gingerbread house relates to the witch's power to make material reality unreal through a false appearance. Texts such as Malleus Maleficarum inform us that European witches were credited with the ability to make men's penises appear to be gathered in a magical box, where they waved like wheat in the breeze. The witch could cause people to appear as animals and vice versa. She could also make baked pieces of children's bodies look like cake. All of these frightful fantasies about witchcraft relate to human anxieties about sexuality, humanity, and food. The gingerbread house is a dwelling place of the human imagination, in all its consolations, its terrors, and its deceptions. The witch's cottage is one visual motif that is always present in representations of the Hansel and Gretel story, no matter how varied they may be. Ballets, operas, stage plays, and storybooks all included. Even a recent film, which takes the Hansel and Gretel story off into a steampunk fantasy of the brother and sister as witch-hunting adults with Gatling guns, retains the house made of sweets, in a form very similar to early illustrations of the tales. Legends. The house made of cake was described long before Hansel and Gretel, and was published as a written text. From medieval times there had been edible houses in stories of distant lands or enchantments. The land of Cockaigne, a fable of wealth and ease, suggested that in this land of plenty there was a monastic house with walls and hallways made of pies and pasties. The anonymous author does not bother with any moral strictures. The tastiest a man could eat, flour cakes are the shingles all, of cloister, chamber, church, and hall. The nails are puddings, rich and fat, kings and princes might dine on that. There you can come and eat your fill, and not be blamed for your self-will. Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, was a 17th century English writer who wrote both serious and burlesque literature. Her romantic fable, Assaulted and Pursued Chastity, published in 1656, recounts a voyage to the kingdom of Amity. A governor lives in a house built with spices, the roof and beams made of cinnamon, and the walls plastered with the flakes of mace, the planches out of nutmegs, the long planches out of ginger. The house was covered on top, some with pomegranates rinds, others of oranges and citrons. This alluring image gives way to the horrors of cannibalism. They had a custom in that country to keep great store of slaves, both males and females, to breed on, as we do, breed flocks of sheep. The children were eaten as we do, lambs or veal for young and tender meat, the elder for beef and mutton, as stronger meats. The edible house could be seen either as a magical bounty or as a sign of evil. These inversions, and the rapid transition from indulgence to danger, gave folkloric tales their edge. History. Gingerbread is a food with many associations. In history, it derives from the honey cakes of ancient Greece and Rome. These were always associated with religions and their festivals. Honey cakes were served in ceremonial ways during rituals and were shaped as symbols and physical forms to connect with divine powers. The honey cakes of the classical world were made of flour or breadcrumbs, which were pounded with oil, eggs, and honey, then baked as flat loaves or decorative shapes. The pagan religions rejoiced in fertility symbols, and eating phallus-shaped honey cakes was considered auspicious in ancient Rome. The goddess Demeter was honored by honey cakes shaped as a female fertility symbol, the moloi. As Michael Crondy has shown in Sweet Invention, A History of Desserts, pagan deities each had their own rituals, often marked by foods shaped into anthropomorphic designs. He comments that later Mediterranean confectionaries, such as St. Agatha's breasts, vaguely Christianized these explicit symbols. Ginger enters history in 500 BC, when mentioned by the Chinese sage Confucius, who said that he always had some when eating a meal. Ginger, first cultivated in China, spread through the trade routes. It was known in the Roman Empire, but was considered a medicine. By the time of the European Crusades, it was sailing across the Mediterranean on trading ships, and larger supplies had made it popular spice. Paul Friedman, on his study Out of the East, Spices and the Medieval Imagination, explains that all spices were understood as having active results on the human body, and ginger was believed by some medieval Europeans to be associated with warmth and life. Its range of uses went from aphrodisiac to flavouring it for a holy day sweet, the Mantis Christi, or Hand of Christ, a white confectionery made with sugar and ginger. The early European recipes for gingerbread were of breadcrumbs, pounded with butter, honey, and spices, and baked as hard biscuits. Sometimes a raising agent was added, and then it was shaped as little loaves of sweetbread. The difference between bread, biscuits, and cake evolved slowly. Gingerbread existed in all these forms and required the specialist skills of bakers. By the 15th century, the makers of gingerbread, and in France the pain d'épices, had their own separate guilds. The most renowned centre for the making of gingerbread was the city of Nuremberg, where the woods all around the city were well supplied with beehives. Gingerbread is always, in effect, a honey cake, although these days the honey is often replaced by treacle or molasses. On the table. Long before the gingerbread house at Christmas, there was the gingerbread man. This figure is eaten at Easter, the time of sacrifice and resurrection. It is possible that the gingerbread man referred to the memories of the pagan sacrifices of the male, either a person or an animal, which heralded the coming of the spring. These brutal rituals were replaced by the Christian teachings of divine self-renunciation and redemption. However, Easter openly appropriated symbols of death, rebirth, and fertility. The Easter gingerbread man, with his spread limbs, is a liminal figure, who might be bounding out of the dolmens and pagan altars of our distant past. It is said that women who eat the gingerbread man are likely to find a husband. More specifically, Christian are the European gingerbread figures of St. Nicholas, baked in December and decorated with red and white icing, marking his clerical garb. These are a staple of German and Polish cuisine. Elizabeth I, herself a figure with an aura of the fairy world, was the first person in historical record to have distributed a festive gingerbread man. Carol Levin, director of the Medieval Studies program at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and author of The Reign of Elizabeth I, has explained that she did do a banquet where she had gingerbread men made to represent foreign dignitaries and people in her court. Gingerbread is mentioned in the plays of Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, and in numerous ballads. There were many local traditions, often symbolic and slightly mysterious, such as the fair noted in the Gloucester Journal of the 10th of January 1914, which always had stalls for the sale of Parliament. This was unaccountably named pieces of gingerbread, shaped as birds, beasts, and fishes. It may be a reference to the popular memory of the English Civil War. The presence of tales and symbols in gingerbread making continues as a creative tradition today. A 1997 gingerbread cookbook by Joanna Farrow features a picture of a beautifully shaped and decorated Hamza, a sign of the open hand, a symbol from the Jewish and Islamic world associated with good fortune. A fashion for houses. As Alan Bragdon writes in his gingerbread book, gingerbread has always had a magical appeal. It does not spoil as quickly as other baked goods, and so lends itself to use in decoration. During the 19th century, gingerbread was both modernized and romanticized. Enter the gingerbread house. Gingerbread houses, as Christmas centerpieces, had become common in German-speaking countries by the early 19th century. They were brought to the America by German immigrants and were favored there, becoming a popular local tradition. Many American Christmas treats, such as peppermint candy canes, are also of German origin. In England, they were less familiar. There is no gingerbread cottage to be found in descriptive 19th century fictions such as Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol or George Eliot's Silas Marner. Instead, English people maintained folkloric traditions around the elaborately decorated 12th cake, lardy cake, mince pies, and plum pudding. All of these were confections which enhanced the feast with symbolic and narrative elements. However, gingerbread houses were made in England. An early example of their presence is that they were included in the 1921 volume The Gentle Art of Cookery. The author, Hilda Lale, was a scholarly British writer with a great interest in the works of the 17th century astrologer and herbalist Nicholas Culpeper. Lale describes how to make a basic gingerbread house and describes it as an old-fashioned treat for children. She also recommends lighting it from within with tea lights. There is no suggestion, though, that in this 1920s British text that the gingerbread house is associated with Christmas. Hilda Lale's early 20th century gingerbread house is similar to those now put on festive tables, but it lacked the elaborate design, and the pieces were not large. They were propped up against each other and joined only with white of egg, rather than the royal icing favoured by professional pastry cooks. Royal icing, which is showy, being pure white and very suitable for decoration, being quick to harden, is also an ideal form of cement for the gingerbread house. From the 1950s onwards, one finds mention in the British media of gingerbread houses and cake baking displays by professional chefs. They drew comment and had features such as spun barley and sugar windows, which would be beyond the resources of most home kitchens. Until the 1980s, the British cookbooks devoted to Christmas celebrations continued to recommend the traditional treats of puddings and pies. Suddenly, in the 1980s, gingerbread houses began to appear in texts about Christmas and throughout the English-speaking world. They are still uncommon in France, where the Christmas bakeries concentrate on the traditional Yule log. The French log cake, like the gingerbread house, is a sweet made with great care as a miniature sculpture, representing a familiar sight from the winter forest. The viewing of such objects is part of the pleasure of consuming them. Australian cookery, which followed British trends, has barely a mention of gingerbread aside from gingerbread men, biscuits for Easter. Again, gingerbread houses for Christmas were not a noticeable feature until the 1980s, when they began to appear alongside other special Christmas fare, especially in illustrated magazines. Even in Northern Europe, where the Germanic traditions of the gingerbread house were already well known, there appears to have been an enhanced appreciation for them towards the end of the 20th century. It was in 1991 that the town of Borgen in Norway began its Gingerbread City Festival. Every November, a display is created of houses, cars, and streets, all assembled out of gingerbread. The items are made by local people and in schools. The sheer size of the gingerbread city, with its numerous details and elaborations, make it a remarkable sight, as well as an indicator that, by the 1990s, gingerbread houses were becoming increasingly popular. The reasons for this Christmas fashion might be a greater willingness to buy professionally made confectionaries. Gingerbread houses are fun to make, but many families take advantage of the availability of elaborate, ready-made, and impressive versions from bakeries. Another allure is that the gingerbread house combines visual appeal with sweetness. It is both a decoration and a cake. It reminds people of childhood, and Christmas is a season which draws meaning from our memories of celebration early in life. A gingerbread house belongs in storybooks, in illustrations, and in a sentiment that tends to celebrate Christmas without defining it through purely religious rituals. The gingerbread house conveys an appearance of Christmas merriment, but its cultural links go back to folklore, and its current status has been attained through fashions in baking and decorating. It demonstrates how religious festivals are represented through secular traditions, and this is a theme of our times. As Jack Sipes has written, our world is full of the influence of the Brothers Grimm and their tales, which have been translated into 150 languages and have seeped into the conscious and subconscious popular memory of people throughout the world. They provide a fund of well-loved motifs like the gingerbread house, recognizable, in a hazy sense of common memory, as part of an often-told fairy story. Thus, it keeps its allure, while the more confrontational elements of Hansel and Gretel's adventure fade into insignificance. Finally, like the honey cakes of ancient Rome, the gingerbread house is a reminder of how sweetness and celebration mark our festivals. By making a confection, which is both a visual decoration and a luscious treat, The gingerbread house rebuts starvation with plenty and joins our distant past, only remembered in legend, with our current life. Therese Taylor is a historian and teaches at the Charles Stewart University, Riverina, Australia. She has published numerous articles in Fortean Times on folklore, literature, and religion, and is the author of Bernadette of Lourdes, Her Life, Death, and Visions, 2008.